Good evening, and welcome. We are here tonight to engage with a question of profound complexity, one that touches the very heart of how societies construct their identities and secure their futures. Our topic is whether the censorship of historical facts is ever acceptable. In this debate, we grapple not with what is true, but with whether all truths must be told at all times, in all contexts. This places the sacrosanct ideal of unassailable absolute truth in direct conflict with the often messy pragmatic necessity of maintaining social stability and peace. To help us navigate this challenging terrain, we have two distinguished guests. Anissa Hassan, a celebrated human rights activist and author, argues that any form of historical censorship is a morally indefensible step towards authoritarianism. And Dr. Kenji Tanaka, a historian specializing in post-conflict reconciliation, who posits that in exceptionally volatile situations, the careful curation of historical narratives can be a necessary, albeit regrettable, tool for healing. Dr. Tanaka, let us begin with your opening statement.
Thank you, Dr. Reed. I wish to begin by clarifying my position, as it is one that can be easily, and I believe, purposefully misrepresented. I am not an advocate for censorship as a desirable state of affairs. Instead, I contend that in the crucible of post-conflict recovery, our ethical calculus must shift from abstract ideals to the concrete imperative of preventing further bloodshed. The question should not be a simplistic, is censorship good or bad, but rather under what meticulously defined exceptional circumstances might the temporary, transparent curation of a historical narrative be the lesser of two evils. It is crucial that we differentiate between malicious, self-serving denialism and what I term responsible, therapeutic curation. Denialism, such as disputing the Holocaust, is a pernicious act designed to erase victims and rehabilitate monstrous ideologies. Responsible curation, conversely, is an act of societal triage. It aims not to erase a truth forever, but to control its dissemination at a time when it can be weaponized. Consider post-World War II Germany. The federal government enacted stringent laws prohibiting the display of Nazi symbols and the dissemination of Nazi ideology. Is this an attack on historical fact? No. It is a clear-eyed recognition that certain historical truths are so toxic, so profoundly dangerous, that their uncontrolled expression poses an existential threat to a fragile democracy. It is a bulwark, not a blindfold. In my work in societies fractured by ethnic violence, I have seen firsthand how raw historical data, stripped of essential context, becomes ammunition for demagogues. They seize upon records of past grievances not to seek justice, but to ignite new cycles of retribution. In such an environment, demanding that every raw, painful detail of the past be immediately and publicly ventilated is not a call for honesty. It is a call for renewed conflict. Therefore, I propose that for a society to heal, to build a bridge from a violent past to a peaceful future, a temporary and carefully managed consensus on its history may be required. This may involve omitting certain divisive details, not to deny them, but to allow for a period of calm reflection and societal rebuilding, after which the full, unvarnished truth can be confronted from a position of strength, not fragility.
Anissa Hassan, your response.
Thank you. Dr. Tanaka presents a case that is seductive in its pragmatism, yet it is a siren song leading us towards a shore of tyranny. My position is unequivocal and absolute. The censorship of historical fact, for any reason, is never acceptable. It is a foundational violation of human rights, and an act of profound disrespect to both the living and the dead. Dr. Tanaka speaks of responsible curation, but this is a dangerous euphemism. What he is describing is the state, or some committee, arrogating unto itself the power to be the ultimate arbiter of truth. This is the very definition of the slippery slope. It begins with the seemingly reasonable goal of preventing violence. But where does it end? Once a government is granted the authority to decide which truths are, quote, safe for public consumption, it has been given the master key to intellectual and political oppression. History teaches us a stark lesson. This power is never temporary, and it is always abused. It will inevitably be used not to protect the public, but to protect the powerful, to erase their crimes, and to construct a sanitized national narrative that serves a political agenda. Furthermore, and perhaps most importantly, to censor the past is to commit a second, grievous injustice against the victims of historical atrocities. For survivors and their descendants, public acknowledgement of the full truth is not an abstract principle. It is a prerequisite for justice, for healing, for the restoration of dignity. To deliberately omit the details of their suffering, to erase the names of perpetrators, to soften the edges of a massacre, is to tell them that their pain is inconvenient, and their truth is subordinate to a manufactured peace. It is a perpetuation of the original crime in a different form. We need only look at the countless authoritarian regimes, past and present, that began their reign by rewriting history books. They understood that to control the future, you must first control the past. They did not begin by burning all the books. They began with, quote, responsible curation, editing out the parts that contradicted the state's glorious narrative. This is how entire populations are led into a state of collective amnesia, unable to recognize the patterns of oppression that are being repeated. True, sustainable peace cannot be built on a foundation of curated omissions and benevolent lies. It must be built on the courage to confront the entirety of our history, in all its horror and all its glory. A society that lacks this courage is not ready for peace. It is merely seeking a pause in hostilities.
Anissa, Dr. Tanaka raises a compelling point about the incitement of violence. In a nation teetering on the brink of ethnic conflict, where historical claims are the very fuel for the fire, does the absolute right to information outweigh the immediate duty to protect lives? How does a society defend itself against weaponized truth without exercising some form of control?
That is the critical question. But censorship is a dangerously flawed answer. The antidote to weaponized truth is not less truth. It is more truth, delivered through robust critical education and relentless counterspeech. When you suppress a historical fact, you do not make it disappear. You invest it with a dark glamour. You empower extremists and conspiracy theorists by allowing them to claim they possess, quote, forbidden knowledge that the state is trying to hide. This creates a far more volatile situation than open debate ever could. The proper role of the state is not to police historical facts. It is to prosecute the act of incitement to violence itself, regardless of the pretext. We must draw a sharp legal line between discussing a past atrocity and calling for a new one. The former is a historical necessity. The latter is a criminal act. A healthy society doesn't hide its ugly history in the attic. It brings it into the classroom. It teaches its citizens how to analyze primary sources, how to detect propaganda, and how to understand that history is a complex tapestry of competing narratives. To shield people from difficult truths is to treat them as children, rendering them incapable of the critical thought necessary to sustain a democracy. The duty to protect lives is paramount. But that protection comes from fostering resilience and intelligence, not from enforcing ignorance.
Dr. Tanaka, Anissa warns of a slippery slope. If we concede that some facts can be curated, who holds the pen? Who decides what is too dangerous for public consumption? What mechanisms can possibly prevent this power from being used to serve political agendas rather than the public good?
Anissa's warning is entirely valid, and it highlights the immense gravity and risk of what I am suggesting. The who is the single most important component. This power must never, under any circumstances, reside with politicians or the state apparatus alone. I envision this not as a clandestine government decree, but as a transparent, public, and temporary process managed by an independent commission. Such a body would have to be unimpeachably diverse, comprising historians from all sides of the conflict, ethicists, sociologists, human rights advocates like Anissa, and, crucially, representatives from the victim communities themselves. Its mandate would be strictly limited in scope and time, perhaps for a period of 5 or 10 years, with its decisions and an explicit sunset clause subject to public review. This is not permanent state control. It is a form of societal triage, an emergency measure for an acute condition. The mechanism for prevention is radical transparency. The Commission's deliberations, its reasoning for why a certain document or narrative is being temporarily restricted, must be public record. The goal is not to pretend the fact doesn't exist, but to publicly agree that, for a short time, its widespread dissemination is akin to shouting "fire" in a crowded theater. The alternative, I must stress, is not the ideal scenario Anissa describes, with perfectly educated citizens critically debating history. In the immediate aftermath of a civil war, the alternative is often societal collapse and a return to killing. It is a terrible choice, but when faced with the abyss, we must have the courage to choose the path that preserves the possibility of a future, even if that path is morally complex.
We now move to closing statements. Anissa Hassan, you have the final word first.
Dr. Tanaka's framework, though well-intentioned, is a fantasy of control. No commission is incorruptible, and no power, once granted, is easily relinquished. The truth is the bedrock of justice, and justice is the only legitimate foundation for peace. To compromise on truth is to build a house on sand. Censorship is, and always will be, the primary tool of the oppressor. Its path, however carefully paved with the intentions of good people, leads inexorably to a place where citizens fear their history and governments own it. A peace that can only be purchased with lies is not peace at all. It is merely a deferred crisis, waiting to erupt with even greater fury when the truth inevitably breaks free.
Dr. Tanaka, your closing statement.
Anissa's idealism is a beacon, a standard to which all stable societies should aspire. However, our primary moral duty in the immediate aftermath of catastrophic violence is to preserve life and prevent future suffering. History is not a science experiment to be conducted in a sterile lab. It is a living, breathing force in the real world. Idealism, when untempered by pragmatism, can be a form of cruelty. To demand that a society, still bleeding from wounds inflicted by its own past, must swallow every bitter, poisonous truth all at once, is not a prescription for health. It is a demand for that society's suicide. We must first stop the bleeding, and sometimes that requires a carefully applied, temporary bandage over the wound.
Thank you both for your insightful and profoundly challenging perspectives. You have laid bare the central conflict of our time, the tension between the absolute moral imperative of truth and the pragmatic, urgent need for peace. You leave our audience with a vital question to ponder. Where does the duty of the historian end and the duty of the peacemaker begin? Thank you for joining us.